Welcome back. All right, so upsets, and I've got 28 of them on the board, going back to 1981 down here, and starting with the most recent upset in 2023. And I went through and grabbed 28 that are noteworthy. There are, I'm sure, others that are noteworthy as well. Most of them are from the first round of the playoffs from 2020. They're from the qualifying round. There's one round two series on the board. There's two round two series on the board, and there you go. So 2 out of the 28 are from the second round, and 2 of them are qualifying round matchups from 2020. Outside of that, all first round matchups. And if it has an asterisk, that means a President's Trophy winner. So we'll start with the most recent. 135 points for the Bruins during the regular season. A President's Trophy does not help them against Florida. Florida came into this one 92 points during the regular season, barely made the playoffs, doesn't matter. Boston led the series 3-1. That also didn't matter. In Game 5 in overtime, Florida wins that one, and they ride that momentum all the way to the Stanley Cup final after going through Boston Games 5, 6, and 7. So, really, it is a huge upset, but I wanted to frame it in terms of, and again, the times I've been watching hockey from 81 through now. Was it the most surprising upset to me ever? No. Was it one of the biggest? Sure, but was it that surprising me? Not really. When a team has 135 points in the regular season, yeah, it's one of those things you look at and go, that's a lot. They didn't really pace themselves, did they? So, we go back to 2021. The Leafs came into a series against Montreal with 77 points. The Habs had 59. And Toronto led that series 3-1, and then it got away from them. It is a 7-game series win for the Montreal Canadiens, and that is, to me, the moment where any argument that, maybe Toronto with the right... No. Toronto at that point, it was clear that that was actually a choke. If you look at the 2020 bubble playoffs, maybe don't take that as seriously. And previous series, they'd always been the road team for a Game 7, but 2021, it was in their hands, and they just let it get away. Then we go back to 2020, and in the qualifying round, we had 2 major upsets. Completely, somewhat unexpected. And I say somewhat because Montreal knocks off Pittsburgh 3-1. Now, the initial plan was to have the qualifying round best 2 out of 3. Teams protested the best 2 out of 3 option because of Carey Price, using him as the example of, he can steal 2 out of 3. Well, he stole 3 out of 4. Montreal had a 500 points percentage going into that playoff, and Pittsburgh a 623. It didn't matter. In the end, Montreal knocks them off 3-1. Meanwhile, out west, the Edmonton Oilers, they were a team that came in with a 585 points percentage, Chicago 514, and nothing was really expected from the Hawks, who won this one 3-1 as well. So, huge upset victory for the Chicago Blackhawks, huge upset victory for the Montreal Canadiens, and it was an absolutely stunning turn. And so this is why I'm wearing Montreal, because 2 of the 3 most recent involve Montreal. 3 of the final 4 on this board involves Montreal. So Montreal's pretty good when they're underdogs, and they also get upset when they're favorites. So 2019, of course, this is a famous one where Columbus sweeps the Tampa Bay Lightning. Tampa Bay had 128 points in the regular season, President's Trophy, and Columbus 98 points. So 30-point difference. And as I said in that series preview, Columbus is dead. And then I went in to do a video on how Columbus might have a chance against Tampa, if maybe, potentially. But once that series started, Tampa Bay was kind of in neutral, and it was a clean sweep for Columbus. So, looking at this matchup between Columbus and Tampa, I actually found this to be more of a shock than Florida over Boston, because Florida had won a President's Trophy the year before, and Columbus had never won a round in their history. Then you go back to 2017. This was a surprise as well. My bracket was broken early by the Nashville Predators. Now, I wasn't surprised to see Nashville do well in 2016 in the playoffs, but 2017 I was quite surprised by this. So Nashville sweeps the Chicago Blackhawks, who had 109 points that year. Nashville had 94. And I believe they were 17th in the standings overall, much like Florida was back in this year. But 2017, that was a bit of a shocker. Then we go all the way back to 2012. The Vancouver Canucks, coming off of a Stanley Cup final appearance in 2011, racked up 111 points. They won the President's Trophy for a second straight year. The LA Kings in the first round only had 95 points coming in. but they won that series 4-1, and they made it look pretty easy. And so that was the first round matchup, and people laughed, but then the Kings went on and won the Stanley Cup. 2010, the spring of Yarrow Halak for Montreal. So Montreal knocks off the Washington Capitals, who had 121 points, won the President's Trophy. For Montreal, it was quite the comeback, too. They were down 3-1 in this series. They only had 88 points during the regular season. But again, Yaroslav Halak, absolutely remarkable run. They then knocked off the Pittsburgh Penguins in the second round before bowing out in the conference final against Philadelphia. The interesting part being then they had to decide between Halak and Price. And there were a lot of people said they got to keep Halak, and they kept Price instead. It worked out pretty well for Montreal, though. So 2009, in the first round, the San Jose Sharks, who won the President's Trophy with 117 points, they lost in the first round in 6 games against a 91-point Anaheim Ducks team. So the Ducks 2 years removed from a Stanley Cup win. For San Jose, a team that looked like they could be a team of destiny, and it just didn't work out. And again, San Jose, long run, near the top of the standings, or in this case, at the top of the standings, just couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. So for them, they don't make it to the final till 2016, which is not on the board. But again, this is about the big upsets, isn't it? 2006, the Edmonton Oilers, on their way to a Stanley Cup Finals appearance, they came into the playoffs with 95 points. The Detroit Red Wings had 124, won the President's Trophy, and in the first round, they lost in 6 against the Edmonton Oilers. So Detroit's remembered for their Stanley Cup victories now, but I also remember a lot of years they lost early, and I don't even have all of them on the board, right? So 2003 in the first round again, and coming off of a Stanley Cup win in 2002 with 110 points, Anaheim had 95. The shock in this one is it was a 4-game sweep for Anaheim. And I remember just that feeling I had of, wait, Detroit's out? Like, I was in complete shock. Anaheim then rolls all the way to the Stanley Cup final that year. So, yeah, really good run for Anaheim, and absolute stunner that Detroit was out in the first round, especially as defending Stanley Cup champions with 110 points. Very, very few people would have been taking Anaheim in that series. Back in 2000, St. Louis is your President's Trophy winner, 114 points for them. San Jose led the series against St. Louis 3-1, lost games 5 and 6, but they win game 7 to win it 4-3. They had 87 points that year, so they were 27 points behind St. Louis. And they still beat them in that series. And again, San Jose is a team that it feels like plays better as the underdogs. Some teams do. Again, Montreal, I think, has over the time I've watched hockey, but San Jose definitely as well. They get upset more as favorites. 1998, the New Jersey Devils had 107 points that year. They were a contender, but in the first round, they ran into an 83-point Ottawa Senators team that knocked them out in 6. Huge upset victory in that one. And huge because, again, Ottawa, I think that was their first time in the playoffs. And for New Jersey, they'd won a Stanley Cup in 95. They would win one in 2000 as well. But that upset in the first round, that was huge. Then 1997's on the board because the Oilers knocked off Dallas. The Oilers and Dallas played each other 6 years in a row. So whenever I see, I'm tired of these teams playing against each other, why don't we go back to 1 versus 8? Yeah, 1 versus 8 is fun, but Edmonton and Dallas played each other a lot. So the idea that you know, if you change it to 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, you'll get all different matchups every year. It's not an exact science, put it that way. So the Oilers came into that series with 83 points. Dallas came in with 104. I felt like Dallas took Edmonton lightly in that series and paid for it. The Oilers win that series in 7 games. 1995, the lockout shortened season of 48 games. The Quebec Nordiques had 65 points going into the playoffs. The New York Rangers were defending Stanley Cup champions, but they were 1 game below 500. They had 47 points. Whatever magic they had in 94 seemed to be gone in 95. So when they upset Quebec in 1995 in 6 games, that was huge. Keep in mind, this is the final year the Quebec Nordiques are in Quebec, and they knew that they were not going to be in Quebec the following year. And so that first round loss against the Rangers, it really stung. It really, really did. Back in 94, now Calgary, Vancouver, points-wise, weren't that far apart. It was second seed versus 7th. Calgary had 97 points, Vancouver had 85. But what to me qualifies this as a huge upset Calgary was up 3-1. Games 5, 6, and 7 all went to overtime, and they were all won by the Vancouver Canucks. Thus, the term Cardiac Canucks was born. They're still the Cardiac Canucks. It's just different reasons. Now it's more of a stress heart attack than a. Are you serious? They won. They actually won. But yeah, for the Vancouver Canucks, of course, this was the start of a run all the way to the Stanley Cup final. 1993, the first round, the Buffalo Sabres had 86 points. Boston 109. Boston, no stranger to losing early in the playoffs when they have a really good regular season. It's a storyline that I've seen play itself out a few times. But Buffalo swept them. And that was a series that right out of the gate, again, much like this one here. It was pretty obvious things weren't working very well for Boston, and Buffalo took advantage. Also in 1993, I have two other series on the board. St. Louis, 85 points that year. Chicago at 106. St. Louis sweeps Chicago in the first round. Now, the Hawks in 93 are coming off of a Stanley Cup final appearance in 1992, and they were a really good team, just were not able to win a Stanley Cup during that era. Also in 1993, and I had to mention this one. This is the last addition to the board, to be honest. I went through all of them, and I was like, I have to include Pittsburgh losing against the Islanders, or that's the one everybody's going to mention, and rightfully so. David Volek, of course, with the game winner in Game 7. 87 points for the Islanders that year, 119 for Pittsburgh. Wasn't it Kevin Stevens that before Game 7 said, the great teams win Game 7s, and we're the great team, so it's ours. And, of course, they'd won the Cup in 91 and 92. They had a President's Trophy in 93. They had, a 17-game winning streak that year? Yeah, it was a ridiculous regular season, and then they were out in the second round against the Islanders, as all four third-place teams in their divisions ended up being the Final Four. Crazy year in 1993, where all the favorites were out early. Back to 1991, I have the Minnesota North Stars' first two series on this board. They had 68 points that year. No business moving all the way to the Stanley Cup final, but they did, where they lost against Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh's first ever Stanley Cup. So in the first round, the 68-point North Stars, who I had no expectations from, beat the 106-point Chicago Blackhawks. So you can see here, 91 and 93, Chicago with really good regular seasons, 106 points in both instances, and they were out early in both times. So again, Chicago was a long run without a Stanley Cup between 1961, I believe, and 2010, but there were opportunities there, and there were really good teams for Chicago. They just couldn't quite get it done. And then in the second round, those same Minnesota North Stars, still a 68-point team, knocked off the 105-point St. Louis Blues. So, yeah, that's a couple of huge upsets right out of the gate there. And as a North Stars fan, I was just in complete shock at that point that the North Stars, and they win both series in 6. They won both series at home. They didn't have to worry about a Game 7 on the road. 1990, the defending Stanley Cup champion Calgary Flames were out in the first round. The LA Kings came in with 75 points, a below 500 record. The Flames, 99 points, and the Kings knocked them out. The famous shot, of course, of, I believe it's still Vernon falling backwards trying to catch a puck. And, yeah, 6-game series win for the LA Kings. Back in 1986, when it was a best-of-5 first round, the New York Rangers, who had 78 points, knocked off the 110-point Philadelphia Flyers. So the Flyers show up on the board for the first time. Of course, people will point out, too, that in 2010, they were down 3-0 against Boston, came back and won that series in 7. That's more of the 3-0 comeback variety than an upset, I felt, for this board, though. So Philadelphia loses that one. The Rangers, as underdogs, below 500, on the board twice with upset victories over teams that were heavily favored. 1985, again, first round, 62 points for the North Stars that year, and for St. Louis, 86. So St. Louis didn't like seeing Minnesota if they were heavy favorites, because Minnesota beat them both in 1985 and in 1991. 1984, it is the Boston Bruins, 104 points. Remember, there's no 3-point games, so that's the equivalent of like 115 to 120 points now. Montreal had 75. So again, below 500, and yet they swept the Boston Bruins in the first round, 3-0. And they played each other, 8 years in a row that Boston and Montreal played each other in the playoffs? It was insane. But nobody complained because the series was always great. It was always must-watch TV. 1982, this is a famous one, the Miracle on Manchester, which is not the finish to the series. So the LA Kings win it in 5 games, 3 games to 2, right? They had 63 points that year. Edmonton had 111. So that's a 48-point difference. That's insane. And the Kings had no business knocking off Edmonton, but in Game 3, Edmonton had a 5-0 lead. LA ties it and wins it in overtime. And that Miracle on Manchester, is what as it was termed, really gave that energy to the LA Kings, and I think made them think, hey, we could win this. And so that's a huge upset victory right there. 1982, also in the first round, the Quebec Nordiques with 82 points that year, so 2 games above 500, defeated the 109-point at Montreal Canadiens. I remember that. And again, it was a 5-game series. I was excited as a fan of the Nordiques at the time. And I was a Nordiques fan right up till 95 and heartbroken when the team moved. But anyways, yeah, a 5-game series win there for the Quebec Nordiques. Not too shabby. 1981, the first upset I remember. And I remember this well because, again, my dad was a Montreal fan, so this was a shocker in my house. The Edmonton Oilers, an upstart team with 74 points during the regular season. They knock off the 103-point Montreal Canadiens in the first round, 3 games to 2. And it was, again, a shocker because the Oilers are a few years out from winning their first Stanley Cup, but Montreal's only a couple years removed from their dynasty. So that's the 28 series on this board. Now, in terms of the most surprising to me, I mean, obviously, the oldest memory here being the Oilers knocking off the Habs. That was huge. I would say that the Minnesota Wild aren't on the board. The Minnesota North Stars, that was although the Minnesota Wild's upset over Vancouver does deserve an honorable mention. But yeah, that was back in 2003. So the Minnesota North Stars run was quite impressive through that first and second round. The Montreal upset over Washington was absolutely stunning. And of course, Columbus over Tampa, Florida over Boston is right there. And if I had to pick another, I would say the Islanders over Pittsburgh as well in terms of the most surprising. But let me know which one surprised you the most, or maybe it's one that's not on the board. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happen upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.